Sometimes the safest place in the world is the one no one ever planned to find. The wind had been rising since late afternoon, carrying the scent of rain across the rolling fields outside Livingston, Montana, where endless stretches of pasture faded into dark pine forests beneath a sky the color of worn steel. By nightfall, the storm had settled over the valley with quiet determination. Rain tapped steadily against the weathered roof of the old red barn, while distant thunder rolled softly beyond the mountains like a memory refusing to disappear. Caleb Brooks barely looked up from the wooden workbench inside the barn. At 38, the former Navy SEAL had grown accustomed to silence. He preferred the company of old timber, the steady rhythm of repairing fences, and the comforting sounds of horses shifting in their stalls to conversations that usually led nowhere. A faded flannel shirt covered his broad shoulders. His jeans were stained with dust and engine grease, and a silver wedding band, long since removed from his finger, rested inside a small tin box on the shelf above his tools. Only one living soul ever shared the barn without invitation. Atlas, the 6-year-old German shepherd, lay near the entrance on a bed of straw, his sable coat glowing softly beneath the hanging lantern. Though retired from years of disciplined service beside Caleb, the dog had never truly learned how to stop watching. His amber eyes followed every sound beyond the walls, every gust of wind, every unfamiliar scent drifting through the rain. The old clock hanging above the stable door crept past 10 o'clock when Atlas lifted his head without warning. His ears stood straight. His breathing slowed. Caleb noticed immediately. Atlas never reacted without reason. He set down his wrench and listened. At first, there was only rain. Then, almost hidden beneath the storm, came 3 quiet knocks. Not on the farmhouse door, on the barn itself, soft enough that another man might have mistaken them for loose branches. Caleb walked toward the entrance, boots pressing into the damp dirt floor. Atlas was already standing beside him, perfectly still. The dog did not bark. He simply stared at the weathered wooden door as though he already knew who waited outside. Caleb pulled it open. Cold rain swept inside with the wind. Standing beneath the dim porch light was a woman wrapped in a soaked denim jacket, her dark blonde hair plastered against her face. Beside her stood a boy of perhaps 10, trying hard to appear brave despite the cold, one arm wrapped protectively around a little girl no older than 6. The girl's small sneakers were covered in mud, and she clutched a faded stuffed rabbit against her chest with both trembling hands. None of them carried more than a pair of worn backpacks. The woman hesitated before speaking, almost embarrassed by the words she was about to ask. "Sir, could we sleep in your barn? Just for tonight. We'll be gone before sunrise." Caleb said nothing. Years of training had taught him to notice everything before trusting anything. The children's clothes were clean despite the rain. Their backpacks were light. The woman avoided looking directly into his eyes, not out of dishonesty, but exhaustion. Before he could answer, Atlas stepped quietly past Caleb. The German shepherd approached the little girl with slow, careful movements, lowering his head until his nose gently touched the sleeve of her oversized sweater. The child froze, then instinctively rested one tiny hand against the dog's neck. Atlas closed his eyes for the briefest moment. His tail moved once. Then he turned back toward Caleb and simply sat beside the family, as if the decision had already been made. Caleb held the woman's tired eyes for a long moment before stepping aside, without saying a word. "The horses have the left side," he said quietly. "The right side stays dry enough if you stack the hay bales. There are blankets in the cabinet beside the feed room. Help yourselves." Relief flickered across the woman's face, so briefly it almost disappeared before she nodded. "Thank you. My name is Emily." Caleb answered only with a slight nod. He had spent too many years learning that names could wait until trust arrived. The little boy tightened his grip on his sister's shoulder as they stepped carefully inside, their wet shoes leaving small prints across the packed dirt floor. Atlas walked beside the girl as though escorting a guest who belonged there. The child looked down at him with uncertain eyes before offering the smallest smile she had probably managed in days. "He likes you," Caleb said, surprising even himself. "He does not hand out trust very often." The girl gently buried her fingers into the thick fur around Atlas's neck. "His fur is warm," she whispered. "I forgot dogs could be this warm." Caleb looked away before she could see the sadness that crossed his face. Emily spread one of the old wool blankets over the straw, while her son quietly gathered another without being asked. The boy moved with unusual care, placing the hay into neat piles and brushing away loose splinters before helping his little sister sit down. Caleb noticed everything. Children who had known only comfort did not learn habits like that. They learned them after spending too many nights sleeping wherever they could. Atlas remained close to the little girl, lowering himself onto the straw beside her until she rested her stuffed rabbit against his shoulder instead of hugging it herself. Outside, the rain continued tapping steadily against the barn roof while the horses shifted lazily inside their stalls, comforted by familiar sounds. Caleb walked to the small wood stove near the tack room and added another split log. Flames slowly climbed higher, filling the barn with gentle warmth and the comforting scent of burning cedar. He poured water into an old kettle and set it over the fire. Minutes later, he returned carrying 4 steaming mugs. Hot chocolate for the children. Black coffee for Emily. Another cup remained untouched in his own hands. Emily wrapped both palms around the warm mug before speaking. "I am sorry for showing up this late." Caleb shook his head. Storms do not ask permission before they arrive. She lowered her eyes, almost smiling. "No, they do not." Silence settled comfortably between them, interrupted only by the crackling fire and the soft chewing of horses finishing their evening hay. Then Atlas suddenly lifted his head. His ears turned toward the open loft above them. Caleb followed the dog's gaze. Nothing moved. No sound came from the shadows overhead. Still, Atlas remained perfectly still, listening to something too distant for human ears. Caleb knew that posture well. It was never fear. It was awareness. He quietly reached for the old lantern hanging beside the staircase, but before taking a single step, the little girl looked up at him with sleepy eyes and asked, "Mister, do you think tomorrow will still be raining?" Caleb looked at the child, then at Atlas, who had not taken his eyes from the darkness above. "I do not know about the weather," he answered softly, "but I think tomorrow can be different." Atlas finally relaxed, though only slightly, and lay back beside the little girl. Even so, Caleb noticed the German shepherd kept one ear pointed toward the loft, as if somewhere beyond the quiet warmth of the barn, the night was still carrying a story that had not yet reached them. Morning arrived quietly, not with sunshine, but with a pale silver light filtering through low clouds that still clung to the valley. The storm had drifted east during the night, leaving the fields washed clean and the air filled with the rich scent of wet earth, pine, and fresh hay. Caleb was already outside before dawn, carrying 2 buckets toward the horse pasture while Atlas walked several feet ahead, his nose working steadily against the cool morning breeze. The German shepherd usually began every morning with the same routine, circling the fence line before returning to the barn for breakfast. Today he did something different. Halfway across the yard, Atlas stopped and looked back toward the barn instead of continuing his patrol. Caleb followed the dog's gaze. The large wooden doors stood slightly open. Through the narrow opening, he could see Emily folding every blanket they had borrowed with careful hands. Her son was sweeping loose straw into neat piles using an old push broom that had been leaning against the wall. The little girl sat beside one of the horses, quietly stroking its nose while whispering something only the gentle old mare seemed to understand. None of them acted like people preparing to take advantage of another person's kindness. They behaved like guests determined to leave a place better than they had found it. Caleb finished feeding the horses before returning to the barn, carrying a paper sack from the farmhouse. The smell of warm biscuits drifted through the cool air. Emily immediately stood. "You have already done more than enough," she said softly. Caleb placed the bag on an overturned wooden crate. "No one starts a day on an empty stomach around here." The little girl's eyes widened when she saw homemade blackberry jam tucked beside the biscuits. She glanced at her mother, waiting for permission before reaching for one. Emily nodded gently, and the child smiled with a quiet joy that seemed almost unfamiliar to her own face. Atlas lay beside her feet, watching every movement with calm satisfaction. Caleb poured fresh coffee into 2 enamel mugs while the boy carefully broke a biscuit into smaller pieces for his sister before taking one himself. Again, Caleb noticed the habit. The older child always made certain someone else had enough first. "What is your name?" Caleb finally asked. "Noah," the boy answered politely. "And she is Lily." Lily offered a shy wave. her fingers still stained purple from the blackberry jam. For a brief moment, the barn felt less like a shelter and more like a family kitchen that had somehow wandered into a field. The peaceful silence lasted only until Atlas suddenly stood. His ears lifted. His body became perfectly still. He walked toward the open barn doorway and sniffed the damp morning air without making a sound. Caleb stepped beside him. Fresh tire tracks cut across the muddy gravel road nearly 100 yards from the property entrance. They had not been there yesterday. Someone had driven by after the rain stopped. The tracks continued down the county road without turning into the ranch, yet Atlas remained focused on the distance long after the sound of any engine had disappeared. Caleb knelt beside the dog, resting one hand gently against the thick fur behind his neck. "You smelled something," he murmured. Atlas blinked once, but kept watching the road. Behind them, Emily had quietly stopped eating. Her face had lost its color. She was staring at the tire tracks with an expression Caleb recognized immediately. It was not surprise. It was recognition. And in that single silent moment, he understood that the storm which had brought this family to his barn had never truly been the one falling from the sky. Emily lowered her coffee cup onto the crate with hands that trembled almost too slightly to notice. Noah instinctively stepped closer to his mother, while Lily continued absent-mindedly stroking the old mare, unaware of the change that had settled over the adults like another gathering storm. Caleb studied the tire tracks once more before looking back at Emily. "Those tracks are not from a delivery truck," he said calmly. They slowed down when they passed the entrance. Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched Atlas, who remained motionless beside the open barn door, his amber eyes fixed on the distant road. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely louder than the rustling leaves outside. "I hope we had enough time." Caleb folded his arms. "Time from what?" She closed her eyes for a moment, searching for words she had probably repeated only inside her own thoughts. "From people who refused to let us disappear." The sentence lingered in the cool morning air without explanation. Caleb did not press her. Years of service had taught him that frightened people often revealed the truth one careful piece at a time. Pushing too soon usually earned silence instead of honesty. Atlas suddenly turned away from the road and walked toward Noah. The boy had been standing unnaturally still ever since the tire tracks were discovered. The German shepherd gently nudged the back of Noah's hand with his nose. The child hesitated before scratching behind Atlas's ears. "He knows when someone is scared," Noah whispered. Caleb allowed himself the smallest smile, usually before they know it themselves. Noah nodded without looking up. "Our old dog used to do that too." Emily's eyes filled with quiet sadness. "Rusty was very old," she said softly. "He stayed behind." Lily finally looked up from the horse. "Mama said Rusty was helping watch the house." Emily forced a gentle smile and brushed a strand of damp blonde hair away from her daughter's face. "Yes, sweetheart. That is what I told you." Caleb noticed something in Emily's expression that did not match her words. It was grief wrapped carefully enough that the children would not recognize it. Atlas slowly returned to the doorway, then paused beside a pair of small muddy footprints leading deeper into the barn. He lowered his nose to one of Lily's footprints, sniffed it, then quietly followed the tiny trail toward the hayloft stairs. Caleb watched with curiosity. Atlas climbed halfway up the wooden steps before stopping beside an old window overlooking the front pasture. Sunlight finally broke through the thinning clouds, casting long golden beams across the wet fields below. From that height, nearly every approach to the ranch could be seen. Atlas sat there in complete silence, watching. Caleb joined him a moment later. "You picked the best observation point in the place," he murmured. The dog remained focused on the distant county road. Caleb leaned lightly against the railing, allowing old instincts to return without effort. The ranch had always been his refuge, but he suddenly found himself studying tree lines, fence gaps, and gravel lanes the way he once surveyed unfamiliar terrain years before. He had promised himself that chapter of life was over. Yet standing beside Atlas, with a frightened family sharing his barn, the habits he thought he had buried felt as natural as breathing. Down below, Lily laughed as one of the horses gently nudged her shoulder, searching for another piece of apple. The bright, innocent sound drifted through the barn, soft enough to warm even the oldest memories. Atlas finally looked away from the road and watched the little girl instead. His posture relaxed for only a moment before his ears lifted again. Somewhere beyond the peaceful fields, carried faintly by the morning breeze, came the distant sound of another engine. It was still too far away for human ears to recognize, but Atlas had already heard it, and this time he did not blink. The distant sound faded almost as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the open valley and the whispering pines beyond the pasture. Caleb remained beside Atlas in the hayloft window for another minute before climbing back down the narrow wooden stairs. He found Emily standing alone near the stove, rinsing the empty coffee mugs with water from an old metal basin, as though keeping her hands busy made difficult thoughts easier to carry. Noah and Lily had wandered outside with permission, laughing quietly as they gathered smooth stones near the fence, while Atlas watched them through the open barn door. Caleb folded a clean towel and placed it beside Emily without speaking. She looked at him, then at the children, and finally sighed with the weight of someone who had spent too many nights pretending tomorrow would solve what yesterday had broken. "You asked what we were running from," she said softly. Caleb nodded once. "Only if you are ready." Emily stared into the basin where tiny ripples still circled across the water. 3 years ago, I believed life could not surprise me anymore. I had a good job at the county library. Noah played baseball every Saturday. Lily thought every butterfly was magic. Then my husband changed after losing his business. Little by little, our home stopped feeling like home. Every conversation became quieter. Every smile became shorter. One day I realized the children had started whispering even when nothing was wrong. Caleb listened without interruption. He recognized that careful rhythm. It belonged to people who had practiced telling themselves the truth before daring to tell anyone else. Emily continued. "I kept hoping things would improve. Sometimes they did for a week. Sometimes only for a day. Then I understood that hope is not the same thing as safety." She looked toward Noah, who had just bent down to help Lily tie the loose lace on her shoe. "So I packed 2 backpacks while they were asleep. We left before sunrise with only enough money for gas and food." Caleb glanced toward the old family photograph resting on a dusty shelf above the tack room. It showed his younger self beside his father years before the ranch had become his responsibility. He remembered something his father often said while repairing broken fences. "Wood could split without making much noise. Families sometimes did the same." "You did the right thing," Caleb said quietly. Emily swallowed hard, blinking away tears before they could fall. "I keep asking myself if I did." The children lost their school, their friends, their rooms, everything familiar. Caleb shook his head gently. Children can rebuild a bedroom. They cannot rebuild a childhood once it is gone. Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment, as though those words had finally reached the place where fear had been living. Outside, Lily suddenly laughed as Atlas rolled onto his side, allowing her to rub his belly while Noah tossed a small stick only a few feet across the grass. The German shepherd ignored the stick completely, choosing instead to remain beside the children. Caleb smiled. Atlas knows his job. Emily watched the dog with quiet wonder. He has hardly left them since last night. Caleb looked toward his old friend. "Years ago, people believed I trained him." He smiled a little wider. "Truth is, he spent most of those years training me." At that exact moment, Atlas lifted his head. His ears stood tall once again. He did not look toward the road this time. He looked toward the mailbox standing at the end of the long gravel driveway, where a plain white envelope rested against the weathered post, even though no one had seen a mail truck arrive. Caleb narrowed his eyes toward the mailbox, the white envelope standing out against the faded wooden post like a fresh patch of snow on dark earth. No delivery truck had passed the ranch that morning. He would have heard it. Atlas would have heard it even sooner. Yet there it was, resting neatly where it had not been only minutes before. Emily followed Caleb's gaze, and the color quietly drained from her face. She did not say a word. She did not need to. Caleb recognized that look. It was the expression of someone who believed the past had finally caught up with them. Noah instinctively stepped closer to his little sister, placing one hand lightly on her shoulder while Lily looked from one adult to the other, sensing the silence without understanding it. Caleb rested a calm hand against Atlas's neck. The German shepherd remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the mailbox, his ears forward, his breathing slow and measured. He was not frightened. He was thinking. That alone told Caleb the situation deserved patience instead of panic. "Stay here," Caleb said gently. Emily opened her mouth as if to object, then stopped herself. She simply nodded. Caleb walked down the long gravel driveway, with Atlas padding silently beside him. The morning air carried the scent of wet grass and wild sage, while meadowlarks sang somewhere beyond the split-rail fence, as though the valley itself refused to surrender its peace. When they reached the mailbox, Caleb noticed something unusual. The envelope bore no stamp, no return address, and no name except a single word written neatly across the front in blue ink. Emily. He carefully turned it over. It had already been opened. Inside rested only one folded sheet of paper. Caleb unfolded it slowly. The message contained just one sentence. You do not have to keep running forever. Nothing more. No signature. No threat. No explanation. Caleb read it twice before placing it back into the envelope. Atlas lowered his nose toward the paper, inhaled once, then lifted his head again. Instead of remaining at the mailbox, he turned toward the fence line bordering the eastern pasture. His pace was unhurried but purposeful. Caleb followed without speaking. The German shepherd stopped beside a section of soft ground where last night's rain had left the soil dark and smooth. There, barely visible unless someone knew where to look, lay a fresh set of boot prints leading back toward the county road. Only one person. Walking, not running. Caleb crouched beside the tracks. Whoever had left the envelope had avoided the driveway entirely, choosing instead to approach quietly through the pasture before leaving the same way. Atlas sniffed the nearest print once more before stepping back. His posture softened. Caleb understood the signal immediately. The scent was unfamiliar, but it carried none of the urgency Atlas usually displayed when danger was close. They returned to the barn without haste. Emily searched Caleb's face before he even spoke. He handed her the envelope. She unfolded the paper with trembling fingers and read the single sentence. Tears gathered in her eyes, not from fear this time, but from recognition. I know that handwriting, she whispered. Caleb waited. Emily looked toward the open pasture where sunlight had finally broken through the clouds, painting the wet fields in quiet gold. It belongs to my older brother, she said. I have not heard from him in almost 5 years. Atlas quietly lay down beside Lily, who leaned comfortably against his shoulder while humming to herself, completely unaware that the morning had just shifted in a direction none of them had expected. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, hope did not feel like something fragile. It felt like someone had quietly found the trail they thought had disappeared. The afternoon settled gently over the ranch, wrapping the fields in warm sunlight that shimmered across puddles left behind by the storm. Emily folded the letter with extraordinary care, as though the paper itself had become something fragile enough to carry hope. She slipped it into the inside pocket of her jacket and stood quietly beside the open barn door, watching Noah help Lily gather wildflowers growing near the split-rail fence. Atlas remained close to them, never wandering more than a few feet away, his calm presence becoming so natural that the children no longer seemed to notice how faithfully he watched over every step they took. Caleb leaned against the weathered doorway, his eyes drifting across the valley. Tell me about your brother, he said. Emily smiled for the first time without forcing it. His name is Daniel. He was always the one who fixed everything around the house. Broken fences, flat tires, even arguments. He used to tell me that every family loses its way sometimes, but someone has to remember where home is. Her smile faded gently. We stopped talking after our father died. Pride can build walls higher than mountains. Caleb nodded slowly. Sometimes it takes years before people realize they have been standing on opposite sides of the same fence. Emily looked toward him with quiet gratitude. Do you think people really change? Caleb glanced at Atlas before answering. I think people remember who they were before life convinced them to become someone else. The breeze carried the scent of fresh pine through the open pasture, and for several peaceful minutes, nothing disturbed the quiet rhythm of the ranch. Horses grazed lazily beneath the cottonwood trees. Meadowlarks called from the fence posts. Somewhere in the distance, water trickled through a narrow creek swollen by the night's rain. It felt less like a place hidden from the world and more like a place patiently waiting for wounded hearts to breathe again. Then Atlas stood. He did not bark. He simply lifted his head toward the western hillside where an old gravel path disappeared between clusters of evergreen trees. Caleb followed the dog's gaze and soon noticed a single figure walking slowly toward the ranch. No vehicle, no hurry, Just a tall man wearing faded work boots, blue jeans, and a brown canvas jacket, carrying nothing except a small duffel bag over one shoulder. Emily stepped forward before she even realized she had moved. Her breathing caught softly. "Daniel," she whispered. The man stopped several yards from the barn, removing his worn baseball cap as though uncertain whether he still deserved to walk any closer. His hair had turned noticeably gray around the temples since Emily had last seen him, but his gentle eyes remained exactly the same. Neither of them spoke at first. Years of silence stood quietly between them, heavier than any suitcase either could have carried. Lily looked up at her mother. "Do you know him?" Emily nodded through gathering tears. "I do." Daniel smiled with equal parts relief and regret. "I was afraid I was too late." Emily walked toward him one careful step at a time until the distance between them simply disappeared. They embraced without a single dramatic word, holding on to one another with the quiet gratitude of two people who had finally become tired of carrying old misunderstandings. Noah watched silently before stepping forward to shake his uncle's hand. Daniel laughed softly, then pulled the boy into a warm hug instead. Lily studied him for a moment before offering her stuffed rabbit. "His name is Buttons," she said proudly. Daniel accepted the little toy with both hands as though it were the finest gift he had ever received. Atlas approached last. The German shepherd stopped directly in front of Daniel and calmly searched his scent with one slow breath. The dog remained perfectly still for a heartbeat before gently pressing his head against Daniel's hand. Caleb smiled to himself. Atlas had reached his decision. Whatever burdens Daniel had carried across the years, the dog found kindness beneath them. As the evening sun settled lower across the Montana hills, Caleb watched the reunited family laughing together outside the old barn. The sound filled the quiet valley in a way no echo ever could. For the first time in a very long while, the ranch no longer felt like a place where people came only to hide. It was becoming a place where they could finally find one another again. The next morning arrived beneath a wide Montana sky, painted in pale blue and soft ribbons of gold. Mist drifted lazily above the pasture, while dew clung to every blade of grass, turning the fields into a sea of tiny diamonds beneath the rising sun. The old barn stood exactly where it always had, weathered by countless seasons, yet somehow different. It no longer felt like a lonely building at the edge of a forgotten ranch. It felt lived in. It felt remembered. Daniel spent the morning repairing a loose section of fence beside Caleb, their conversations beginning with practical things before quietly wandering toward stories they had not shared with anyone else in years. Neither man hurried to fill every silence. They understood that trust often grew best in the spaces between words. Nearby, Noah eagerly carried fence posts that were almost too heavy for him, while Caleb showed him how to measure each section carefully before placing it into the ground. "Strong fences are not built by rushing," Caleb said with a patient smile. "They stay standing because every piece supports the next one." Noah nodded thoughtfully, repeating the lesson with every board they secured together. On the other side of the pasture, Emily and Lily gathered fresh eggs from the chicken coop. Lily laughed each time one of the hens wandered away from her tiny footsteps, and Emily realized she had not heard that carefree sound in longer than she wanted to admit. Atlas followed the little girl from a respectful distance, never interfering, simply watching with the quiet devotion that had become as constant as the morning light itself. Whenever Lily stopped to admire a butterfly or pick a wildflower, Atlas stopped too, settling into the grass until she was ready to continue. Around noon, Caleb opened the large sliding doors of the barn, allowing warm sunlight to pour across the wooden floor where the family had spent the previous night. Emily stood in the doorway for several moments, her fingers resting against the weathered frame. "Yesterday this was only a place to hide," she whispered. "Today it feels like the first room of a new life." Caleb looked around the barn with thoughtful eyes. The folded blankets had been returned neatly to their shelves. The coffee mugs were clean. The straw had been gathered. Nothing extraordinary had changed inside the building itself. Only the people had changed. Daniel walked in carrying a small wooden birdhouse he had assembled from leftover lumber in Caleb's workshop. He handed it to Lily. "Every home should invite something beautiful to stay," he said. Lily hugged the birdhouse against her chest as though it were made of gold. "Can we hang it here?" she asked. Caleb smiled. "I think the barn would like that." Together, they fastened the little birdhouse beneath one of the old rafters overlooking the pasture. Atlas sat below, watching quietly as a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh cedar through the open doors. By late afternoon, a pair of bluebirds landed on the nearby fence, filling the air with cheerful songs that seemed to bless the simple moment. Emily noticed them and quietly slipped her hand into her brother's. For the first time in years, she was no longer wondering where they would sleep that night. She was thinking about tomorrow with hope instead of fear. Caleb rested one hand on Atlas's shoulder, and the old German shepherd leaned gently against him without taking his eyes off the family. Some places were built to shelter animals. Some were built to store harvests. And sometimes, without anyone planning it, an old barn became the place where broken hearts remembered that home was never measured by walls or roofs, but by the people who chose to leave the door open. Autumn arrived quietly across the Montana Valley, brushing the cottonwood trees with shades of amber and gold while cool evening breezes carried the familiar scent of pine, fresh hay, and wood smoke across Caleb's ranch. Weeks had passed since the storm had delivered unexpected guests to the old barn, yet every corner of the property seemed to remember that rainy night as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. The small birdhouse Daniel had built now sheltered a family of bluebirds whose cheerful songs greeted every sunrise. Noah had become strong enough to help Caleb repair gates without being asked, learning that patience built more than fences. Lily had claimed a favorite spot beneath the old oak tree where she sat every afternoon reading picture books aloud to Atlas, convinced the faithful German shepherd understood every word. Perhaps he did. He never wandered far from her voice. Emily found work at the library in the neighboring town, and every evening she returned with a peaceful smile that no longer seemed borrowed from happier memories. The worry that had once followed her like a shadow had slowly surrendered to ordinary routines, and ordinary routines, Caleb knew, were often life's greatest miracles. One cool Saturday morning, the family gathered beside the barn to share breakfast around a weathered picnic table Daniel had restored from old lumber stored in the workshop. Fresh biscuits, scrambled eggs, homemade blackberry jam, and hot coffee filled the table while sunlight filtered gently through the turning leaves overhead. Laughter came easily now. It no longer sounded cautious. Caleb watched quietly from the end of the table, holding his coffee mug while Atlas rested at his feet. The old German shepherd had grown grayer around his muzzle, but his eyes remained steady, warm, and impossibly wise. Lily slipped away from the table carrying the faded stuffed rabbit she had protected through every uncertain mile of their journey. She walked to Atlas, wrapped her tiny arms around his neck, and carefully laid a soft patchwork quilt across his back. "You kept me warm first," she whispered. "Now it is my turn." Atlas looked up at her with calm amber eyes before leaning gently against her shoulder. Caleb lowered his gaze for a moment, feeling something inside him settle into a quiet place he had almost forgotten existed. Years earlier, he had believed peace arrived only after every battle ended. Standing there beneath the wide Montana sky, he finally understood that peace sometimes arrived much more simply, through shared meals, repaired relationships, children's laughter, and a faithful dog who always seemed to recognize home before anyone else did. Daniel raised his coffee mug toward Caleb. "Thank you," he said softly. Caleb smiled and shook his head. "You found your way here. I only opened a door." Emily looked toward the old barn where rain had once echoed across the roof through the darkest night of her life. The building had not changed. Its boards were still weathered. Its paint was still faded. Yet it had become sacred in a way no one could explain, because hope had quietly walked through its doors carrying muddy shoes and two frightened children before leaving behind a family made whole. A cool breeze stirred the tall grass, sending thousands of golden seed heads dancing beneath the afternoon sun. Atlas closed his eyes as Lily continued resting beside him, her small hand buried gently in the thick fur around his neck. No one spoke for several peaceful moments. No one needed to. Some stories do not end because every problem disappears. They end because hearts that once carried fear finally discover they no longer have to carry it alone. And in the quiet stillness of an old Montana barn, where one simple act of kindness had changed every life it touched, grace arrived without fanfare, settled softly among ordinary people, and stayed.